Welcome to another episode of College Admission TV. Dr. J.P. Novin speaks with Dr. Pano Kanelos of the University of Austin about the founding of UATX, the creation of the AOS group, and its tuition-free inaugural model.
Welcome to Season 3 of the Higher Education Leader Podcast. This season, we're exploring AI, higher education, and the future of workforce. I'd like to thank our sponsor, ASU GSV, for supporting this season, and for our listeners to know that you could tune in Spotify and watch our full conversation on College Admission TV. I'm your host, JP Novin, and today I'm honored to welcome Dr. Pano Kanelos. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Well, you have a very fascinating background. You've been deans and you held many prominent positions in higher education. You were the president of one of the most historical universities, University of St. John's College in Annapolis. And also, you were also the founding president and chancellor of University of Austin. And my understanding is now you're a founding partner of Athos Group. Why don't you give us a little background about, your experience in higher education, Athos Group as well? I think our listeners would much appreciate that.
Of course. So I spent my career in higher education. Actually in education, right when I came out of college, I did Teach for America. And so I was a middle school teacher for a brief stint, which was literally the hardest thing I've ever done. It's harder to be an 8th grade middle school teacher than to start a new university, believe me. And then I went from there into grad school. I did my PhD in literature and political philosophy at University of Chicago. And then was a professor. My field is Shakespeare. So I was professor of drama and literature for a number of years, moved into administration. I became a dean at Valparaiso University, and then became increasingly interested in how colleges and universities run and how they should run and how we should be thinking about higher education. And so I moved to become president of St. John's College, which, as you said, is the third oldest college in the United States. It was founded in 1696. So actually before there was a United States.
Yes.
It goes Harvard, William & Mary, then St. John's. Very wonderful, historic, small liberal arts college in Annapolis, Maryland. And from there, I became involved with this project to start the University of Austin. And so I went from being president of the third oldest college in the United States to America's newest university. And that gives you some interesting perspective, to be honest, thinking about legacy and legacy institutions in the future. And University of Austin, we started the project in 2021. I came in really as one of the first person on the ground and the first person that hiring people. We began in 21 and promised that we would have our first freshman class by the fall of 24. And we did. Got through the, authorization process, applied for accreditation, built a campus, recruited students, recruited faculty, raised a couple $100 million, got the students in the door in the fall of 24. And now this past fall of 25, the second cohort of students arrived. So at University of Austin, there are now freshmen and sophomores, and we'll build out those classes every year. But I realized that my real calling in life while I was building University of Austin was to be a builder. I so enjoyed the process of building it that as we got the school up and running and the students came in and everything was sailing safely ahead, I thought, well, maybe I should take some of the lessons that I learned building a single university and think about how I could scale that experience and help create new institutions, not just universities, but institutions that are sort of dedicated to the common good, dedicated to human flourishing. And so we started the Athos Group this month to work with institutions and organizations that are either going from 0 to 1, so starting from scratch and getting to 1, or early stage institutions that are going from 1 to 10. And helping with everything from strategic planning to vision casting to philanthropic planning to governance to accreditation, the whole gamut of things. And it's been fascinating. I mean, we already have clients around the world, working both in higher ed and outside higher ed. And what's most exciting to me is that the impulse to build University of Austin was the impulse to build. We believe that in a time where institutions seem to be shaky and faltering, that new institutions are what can help reset the sector of higher education. And I believe that more broadly, that we need new institutions across society. So, our goal, my goal at this point, is to facilitate the founding of new institutions.
And if I'm not mistaken, University of Austin, is it tuition free? I mean, is it?
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, how does that work?
So the university, we began with the first class, the inaugural class. We had raised enough money to make the university tuition free, or let's say to fully scholarship the students. So there was a tuition rate, but they were fully scholarship for 4 years. We were able to offer that to the second class. And I think what we sort of realized along the way is that you can build a model that actually does not rely on tuition if you carefully cultivate and steward the resources you have. And so the ambition going forward from here forward is, at least in the near term, to continue to keep the school tuition free. What that enabled us to do early on was really to bring in some of the most extraordinary students. We were really going, the inaugural classes we had, really, we were drawing students from who had got into top universities elsewhere, but who were looking for something a little more dynamic and new and creative. And so by being competitive on the financial front, we were able to be extremely competitive on the academic front and start out very strong.
Well, that's the power of being new, right? I mean, it's very hard to do that if you've been around for a few hundred years, or you have a long legacy. So you're really an interesting, president, in a sense that you're entering this era of higher education and AI simultaneously. I mean, this is such fascinating time. So it's hard to plan 50 years for AI, but let's focus on the next 5 years. How do you perceive the impact of artificial intelligence on the future of the workforce over the next 5 years?
To answer that question, I think we have to look at things even from like a bit further out and just think about the purpose of universities and how that relates to what we're seeing right now with the AI revolution. And I believe, very strongly that this moment in time is like the next major turning point for higher education, that higher education is going to be reinventing itself. So if we kind of, wind the clock back a couple centuries, universities have always been essentially places that prepare people for the knowledge economy. Even back when, back in the Middle Ages, when Bologna and Oxford and the Sorbonne were all founded, what did you study at university? You studied the few disciplines that were actually intellectual in nature, right? To be a lawyer, a doctor, a theologian, that was the knowledge economy. And you went to universities for that. Throughout most of the history of higher education, the kind of work in the world that was primarily intellectual in nature was relatively limited. Yet what we see at the beginning of the 20th century is the rise of the dominant knowledge economy. And so suddenly universities had to scale up. The knowledge economy needed lots and lots of people who could do what you do in a knowledge economy, which is master the arts of numbers, the arts of letters, critical thinking. So higher education had to kind of massify and become the sort of primary conduit for workers in a knowledge economy. That's when we see the rise of the Research One University at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's, what we see, the expansion of the university education from being really just serving a tiny number of mostly elite students to being, let's say, broadly democratized, was because we needed to pull these workers into the knowledge economy. Now, here's where we get to AI. This is where everything changes. For the past 100 years, universities have primarily been teaching people how to master numbers, language, and critical thinking. AI can do that for us now. So we have to be thinking now about the kind of obsolescence of that whole mode of education. The whole idea that you go to a university to become somebody who is, literate, or, is numerate, or even a critical thinker, that changes. And so thinking now about this point forward, what do universities serve? How is AI going to be, let's say, driving that train? It's a huge question. And I will say that I'm convinced it's going to massively change higher education. I think before we know that, we really have to press against the limits of AI and see what it can or can't do. And I don't think we know that yet. I don't think we know how far we're going to go with AI. So we're in this kind of gray zone right now where everybody's sort of taking one step forward, a half step back, thinking about how AI applies, how it might not apply. And I think these are the most interesting conversations that we're having today. I don't think we're yet situated to have the long-term answer, but we understand we're kind of in a crucible of discovery.
Well, I read somewhere that you were basically, described as someone that talked about building rather than reacting. But the question that kind of rises now is, how do we not react to professions and industries that are at risk of not being around in the coming years? I mean, in your mind, are there professions or industries that might be a shell of themselves 5 years from now? I mean, are you thinking how some careers or some jobs might completely not just change, but ultimately not even be around?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's always been the case. There's always jobs that have been sunsetted.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a time when, you can make your whole career as a typesetter, for newspapers, right? And so I think that's a kind of normal process. I think the difference now is that the jobs that are becoming obsolete are knowledge economy jobs, not manual jobs. So I think for the most part up till now, things that have become obsolete are things where machines could do things better in the material world, in the physical world, replacing mostly manual labor. Now we're replacing intellectual labor. So for example, I think a job, and I hate to say this because my sister-in-law is a radiologist, I think a job like radiology will become obsolete very quickly, right? Because what does a radiologist do? They take their knowledge and their experience to read scans, to carefully look for, different signs of, that might indicate some sort of, disease or problem in the kind of internal nature of the human body. Well, if your job is to scan information and compare it to everything and yet a machine can come do that and scan information and compare it to an infinitely greater number of examples, that work will become obsolete very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so I do think, I do think we're going to reach a point where a lot of things that we have relied on extremely educated, extremely skilled people to do are going to be displaced. I think we're seeing this already with things like advertising and graphic design. You could just ask AI to produce a slide deck for you. 2 years ago, you had to hire the graphic designer and they would take 2 weeks and charge you a few $1,000s to get the fancy slide deck. Now you just sort of think about it and AI produces it for you. So I do think there are quite a number of things that are going to change. The real question here, I think, isn't, which jobs are going to be obsolete, and then therefore what jobs should we be training for? But like, what is the responsibility of those of us in universities vis-a-vis the rise of AI? And the way that I see it, and I could be wrong on this, I mean, I'm just some stupid Shakespeare scholar. What do I know about machines, right? But the way that I see it is this: At this point in time, what AI does is it aggregates information, right? It
Mm-hmm.
goes out there and with like, miraculous speed and breadth, it can sort of encompass information, consolidate it, and then produce something. Well, AI is only as good as the information it has on hand to draw from, right? It's not producing information. It's, sort of, it is summarizing information, organizing information, making suggestions. AI right now depends upon the totality of human intellectual work that has been at least downloaded onto the internet. At some point, we have to start thinking about not the output, which is what AI is involved with, but the input. What are we putting into that pool? What are we putting into the storehouse of knowledge? And that's where I think human beings still have a major role to play. We're filling the storehouse of knowledge. AI is manipulating that on our commands as a tool to try and help us extract from that storehouse things that are useful. So that's how I think about universities. How are we going to continue to contribute to the storehouse of knowledge in a way that's ultimately productive?
Well, when we look at, yes, the Industrial Revolution took about 50 to 70 years to take place, and a lot of jobs. There were less horses around. People were not running around lighting in New York and other places, and lanterns and kerosene. Even internet, has created a lot of jobs, but also displaced a lot of jobs. But is it fair to say that the question becomes run rate? We know more jobs are going to be created. That's not the issue. The issue is, as people are working towards their 70s and 80s now, right? You're looking at entry-level jobs, whether it's driving car, whether it's coding or what have you. Do we have enough run rate in the next 5 years to actually have all of these jobs that are going to be displaced with new jobs? I think that's the juxtaposition we're dealing with that's different than any other industrial revolutions we've had in the past.
Well, it's an excellent question, and I don't know. I don't know. It's whether or not there's going to be massive disruption because the rate of job production is not going to sufficiently replace the jobs that are being lost. I don't know. What I do know is higher education, and what I would say higher education is radically unprepared to move fast enough, quick enough, or be dynamic enough to pivot and flex at this particular moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the problems we have is that universities are the most slow-moving, sclerotic institutions you can imagine. And so at this really critical moment when we're thinking about how do we evolve these institutions to be ready for the next major, social turning, the institutions themselves don't have the innate capacity to reinvent themselves. It doesn't mean that the occasional institution led by the occasional extraordinary leader can't sometimes get a lot of things right, but as a sector, as a whole, they can't. So I'll give you an example of how I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking sort of systemically. Having just built a university, I'll say one of the greatest impediments to innovation and creativity at the university level is the accreditation process. The accreditation process essentially says, in order for you to be accredited as an institution and be able to access all the benefits of being an accredited institution, you have to show us that you're building an institution that looks pretty much exactly like all the other institutions. You have to check the boxes that they already check. And if you don't, you're not going to get accredited.
Yeah.
And accreditation, by the way, takes 7 years. So you can't change things for a very long time. So one of the things that we're doing with the Athos group is we are building a brand new global accreditor that's going to operate on a totally different model that is actually incentivizing innovation, incentivizing entrepreneurship, challenging the dominance of the Carnegie unit as the unit of credit in higher education, thinking about higher education as not a sector, but a segment in lifelong education. And so we're creating a new accreditor that's going to kind of upend all the assumptions of the kind of legacy accreditors. Why? Because new accreditors like this will help new institutions stand up and get moving a lot faster. And will actually incentivize people who have creative ideas who want to jump into higher education to do so because they'll see a pathway.
So on that point, so accreditation, there's been discussion, especially with the current administration, as far as how accreditors may start acting. But furthermore, how does higher education evolve? When you look at the structure of 4 years, now up to 6 years of a bachelor degrees, then you have, a couple of years of master's degree, and then depending on the major, 3 to 8 years of PhD or doctorate degrees. How do you think that might change in lieu of information being so ubiquitous and so available now out there, especially with internet and now AI?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're already seeing the kind of disaggregation of higher education. I mean, students are coming in and they're doing loads of online college courses before they even get there. So they're encountering higher education outside the traditional setting. Through continuing education, professional training, education is sort of available anywhere, anytime, at a very, very low cost.
Yeah.
The idea that we kind of box together this thing called a bachelor's degree, and that it's a 4-year project, and that if you haven't somehow passed through that particular experience, you aren't prepared for the world. That's a ridiculous premise. In fact, I've been for a long time advocating as a remedy to the financial crisis in higher education that we should move away from the 4-year standard model for bachelor's degrees in the US. If you think about it, in the UK and other countries, 3 years is the standard bachelor degree. Okay, so you can do a bachelor's in 3 years. Why do we do it in 4? Nobody has an answer to that. Why are universities 120 credit delivery systems? I ask this question in every context. Nobody knows. It's just the way we've always done things. If we move down just a simple, and I think we should be more radical than this, but if we made a simple adjustment and said that the standard bachelor's degree is 3 years, 90 credits, we would cut the cost of higher education in half. Because not only would you save that 4th year of tuition and room and board and everything, but you'd probably be earning money in that 4th year. And so it would radically make higher education more affordable. Why don't we do this? Because the 4-year model serves existing institutions. You would be decreasing their customer base by 25% and their revenue streams. So it's not about preparing young people for the world and what they need. It's about perpetuating this, this kind of lumbering model of higher education. So what's going to happen is disruption is going to happen anyway. Students are going to seek more flexible, more affordable models. Employers are going to try to find ways to continue to work around the system because it's not adapting. And we're going to see, massive closures in higher education. We're already seeing it, but this will provide opportunity for new institutions to kind of step up and address this, this current crisis and situation. So how are things going to change? I can't tell you specifically what they're going to change into, but I can tell you they will change because new competitors are going to enter a volatile market, and those new competitors are going to bring new ideas, and those new ideas are eventually going to become dominant. In the mid-19th century, the universities that dominated world higher education, I think it was 8 out of the top 10 were in Germany, none were in the US, and 48 out of the top 50 were in Europe.
That's right.
Fast forward 100 years, the mid-20th century, the entire top 50 is dominated, with a few exceptions, by American universities. Why? Because American universities reinvented the model at the end of the 19th century, and everybody else had to adapt. We're at another moment in time where universities are going to be reinvented. And I'll tell you what, I don't think America is going to dominate the next century, because the places that are encouraging experimentation and innovation, largely because of market forces, are outside the US system. And so I think we're going to see a kind of swarm of new institutions. I know we are, because so many of these new institutions are contacting us for advice, and that a swarm of new institutions that are ready to kind of muscle their way into the higher ed space and are doing it with a lot of creativity.
Well, when you look at other systems around the world, so they're dominated by egalitarianism systems, such as the one in the Scandinavian countries and what have you. But you have very few choices as you move up, right? There's only so many majors and so many jobs available. You just can't be a doctor, or there's quotas for all of this, right? But it's very synchronized. If you look at some like Singapore, they're very utilitarian, and basically it's very state coordinated in most of these countries. We've always been known for our freedom and diversity in education, but it's a much bigger system. I mean, when you look at the number of universities, we probably have 1/3 of all universities that are at least considered universities. I'm not talking about mom and pop in a strip mall, the colleges out there. But I'm just saying that, where do you think the change in the US is going to come from? Is it coming from the liberal arts colleges, the new universities? Where does this change start from, really?
So I think you're right that historically the US higher education system has been heterogeneous. Like, there have been lots of different options. I think that has become decreasingly so over time. So if you go to most schools today, whether it's a 500 person liberal arts college or a 50,000 student big flagship state university, they offer the same majors, they offer the same programs. The big university might have more, but it's still the same model, the same majors, and the same idea, which is, I think, is a fundamentally flawed idea, that you have this thing called a college major, and that major leads you to gainful employment, right? I mean, most majors are designed after the research interests of people who have never left universities. How are they going to prepare you for the rest of your life? So that if you look today, I mean, I've been on many panels discussing, let's say, the future of liberal arts education. And one of the problems that liberal arts schools are having right now is most of them are indistinguishable from comprehensive universities, other than the fact that they're often seem to be maybe a little smaller, a little more intimate in terms of their campus. Liberal arts schools are, in terms of curriculum, are almost indistinguishable. There are exceptions, like St. John's, total exception. It's a great book school. There's some other exceptions.
Singular major.
Yep. So, but on the whole, schools are kind of, they're just replicating each other's programs. So one of the places that change is going to come from is, as we all know, demographically, higher education is in big trouble. There are fewer and fewer college students who are going into traditional institutions. And so as schools close down, what they leave in their wake are tremendous resources that can be repurposed. I just got a message today from a friend of mine who sent out on LinkedIn a notice looking to buy a small failing liberal arts college to convert into a new university. And he has in his mind a totally different model. He's going to be able to buy pennies on the dollar, accreditation, a campus, probably retain faculty, but completely turn that institution into something else because he wants to compete differently on the market. So as schools start to fail, there are resources, I think, that could be, cultivated from the existing institution and repurposed. And I also think schools that want to succeed, the ones that have resources, are starting to understand that in a highly competitive market, they have to be differentiated. Whereas in the past, everybody was trying to look like the Ivies, sometimes literally. I went to visit Vanderbilt recently, And they demolished most of their dorms about 5, 6 years ago and
Mhm.
built these quads, gorgeous buildings that look exactly like the quads at Yale.
Yeah.
And what it said was Vanderbilt wants to be like Yale. Now, Vanderbilt actually, I think, is doing a lot of wonderful things, but whereas let's say the ambition of universities in the past was to try and mirror the elite prestige of elite universities by looking more and more like them and offering what they had. I think the elite universities are now going to have to differentiate themselves from one another, and that's going to create a ripple effect of differentiation. So again, I can't predict every kind of model that's going to emerge in this moment, but I'm pretty confident that we're going to see a massive number of new models and new attempts to build different things in higher ed, some of which are going to make it and some of which are going to fail. But I think that's good for the system.
Well, most presidents I've spoken with, they like that old Winston Churchill adage. It's not even him, but it sounds like him, that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. So most of us believe that's what's going to happen. But there does seem to be a void in vision, right? So if you go back to beginning of the 1900 to the John, even after that, a John Dewey era, as far as the goal and purpose of higher education, it's gone through so many iterations, right? 3,000 university later, we have universities of all sizes. Many that were not ruled at one time are ruled today, and basically technology has changed. So do we even know what the purpose of higher education is? What is our national vision, aside from it's worked in the past, so it's going to work in the future, giving all the headwinds that we have? Is there a consensus on why we should even have universities?
No, I don't think there is. I think that's part of the problem. I don't think there's a consensus. I think there are, let's say, various kind of narratives about the purpose of higher education that sometimes overlap and sometimes separate. For example, higher education is to prepare the workforce of tomorrow. That's one story. Higher education is to prepare citizens to be productive members of society. It's another story. Higher education is for personal edification and personal growth. That's another story. And we've in some ways kind of sort of wound these different narratives together over time. But I don't know that they add up to a single, total, comprehensive story.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we have these strange places called universities? Universities are very strange institutions. They don't really make much sense. Historically, they were completely eccentric. And that, what I mean by that is outside of society. We call universities the academy. The original academy was an olive grove way outside of the city of Athens, right? Where Plato would gather his pupils in the grove of Academus, who was this hero who had a shrine there. And then that's why they called it the academy. And the whole point was like to really think clearly, to really do the work of the mind, which is important for civilization. You have to be separate from commerce, separate from what happens in the polis, in the city. And for a long time, that really was the model of universities. If you think about Oxford and Cambridge, for example, were universities that were built kind of in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
They weren't in London. The idea was you went to these places and they were distinct locales dedicated to a kind of different mission than the kind of hurly-burly of everyday commerce and business and politics. When we think of universities as pre-professional training, what we're doing is we're sort of bringing the world of commerce and business into spaces that traditionally have been isolated from that. And it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, we say universities we get these people who have these things called doctorates, these PhDs, where they produce this, this dissertation, this intellectual masterpiece, which shows that they've mastered a particular kind of intellectual field. And we put them all on these campuses, and they're doing work that is mostly esoteric and very narrow in that. And then we channel kind of normal, everyday, emerging adults through these institutions and think that on the other end, they're going to come out and they're somehow going to be prepared to be great businessmen or great political leaders. That it's a strange system. And I mean, in many ways, I like the French system more, where you have particular institutions dedicated to particular ends. Like here we study politics. If you want to be a civil servant, you go here. Here we study the hard sciences. If you're going to be a science, you go here. So there's a kind of institutional center of gravity that's very purposeful. American universities want to be everything to everybody, and I think that kind of centrifugal force ultimately pulls them apart from being cohesive.
I guess my one of my last questions is, both of us study liberal arts. Today, if a parent comes to a president of a university and says, my son or daughter wants to study political science, English or philosophy, one of the core liberal arts majors, and what would we tell them in terms of how this world is changing? How they should be thinking about all of this, and they're like, by the way, I'm going to have to spend $200,000 for them to get a degree, and I'm not sure if they'll have a job. I mean, how do we have that conversation with parents at the same time, not lose the context for liberal arts, liberal sciences?
Well, first of all, I'd say as long as a college education costs $200,000, we will never gain their confidence. I mean, that's just a travesty. That's separate from the question of can they benefit from studying English or the liberal arts. And I would say, from my experience at St. John's College, right? St. John's, as you said, one major, basically students read 200 great books over 4 years. They do all the same courses together in the same sequence. They study everything through primary text. When your first course on mathematics, your freshman year, you're actually reading Euclid and learning how he thought about geometry. It's a deep dive into the genealogy of ideas and how those ideas have become more and more complex over time. None of it has any practical application. None of it pretends to be pre-professional. But I'll tell you what, when those students graduate from St. John's, what they've learned is not how to be a banker, not how to be a politician. They've learned how to solve the Rubik's Cube of life. They've had to think so hard and in such great detail about so many big and complicated things that they've sort of strengthened the muscle of their mind in a way that, they'll get the on-the-job training to become whatever it is that they want to become, and they're ready for it. And so I watched students go from St. John's into success in just a massive variety of fields because they could pretty much tackle anything. So to me, that's the purpose of higher education right now, isn't to align particular courses or particular narrow skills with what the job market's asking for, because the job market's going to change every few years. It's to be institutions that strengthen the muscle of the mind so that when students leave there, they are qualitatively different than when they entered and massively prepared to outthink the machines. Like, that's the goal. How do we create graduates who can outthink the machines? They can stay a step ahead of the machines so that we continue to give direction rather than take direction. And to me, that's the hallmark of the high watermark of higher education, that we graduate young people who have thought so deeply and so complexly about so many things that matter, that every question that arises for them for the rest of their life, professional or otherwise, they're able to look at in a complex, critical fashion and come up with reasonable, actionable answers.
This has been enlightening and fascinating. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Likewise.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the College Admission TV Presidential Podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll bring you another insightful conversation with a distinguished leader in higher education.